Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And basically we are answering the most important part of the special military operation, the part when this war can be finished within the next several days. We are talking right now about the negotiation process, about the talks that took place yesterday on the territory of France. I'll remind you that the delegation of the United States of America, the delegation of France, United Kingdom, and Germany and Ukraine, of course, itself, came to Paris with the purpose to discuss the general ceasefire. General ceasefire and most likely security guarantees on the settlement of the conflict. A general ceasefire in Ukraine is being discussed in Paris, which could begin as early as April 20th. So after all these talks, after all these, let's say, different positions from different countries, for example, Donald Trump made his own statement. He stated that Trump said he expects Russia to respond to the ceasefire proposal in Ukraine this week. So today is Friday, so there are 3 days left, 2 days left. After that, we will make a decision. I believe peace is coming to Ukraine, he added. Next Thursday, a mineral agreement with Ukraine will be signed. So a week after ceasefire established. When talking about the Russian side, of course, they have their own position regarding this situation. And for example, yesterday after talks in Paris, Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, had conversation with Marco Rubio, and they discussed the situation in Paris. They discussed, I believe they discussed whether the Western countries, mainly the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Ukraine, accepted the Russian demands. And most likely, Lavrov got answer to this very important question. And later, the Russian representatives in the United Nations Organization made his own statement, and probably based on the conversation between Lavrov and Marco Rubio. Russia's permanent representative to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenza, stated that a ceasefire in Ukraine is unrealistic at this stage. Anyway, despite this statement, we got report that Putin has not issued any new instructions on the effect of the moratorium on strikes on Ukrainian energy facilities. I'll remind you that yesterday this period for the Russian side ended, and now the Russians, according to let's say rule or law of war, has full right to resume the attacks on the energy facilities. But we see that the Russians haven't started anything like this, which means that this might be like a very huge big signal that maybe this upcoming weekend on the 20th of April of 2025 the ceasefire, let's say general ceasefire, will be established. Anyway, let's wait and see. But as for the current situation on the ground, we see completely different let's say picture. And for example, yesterday Zelensky made his own comments about the situation on the ground, and he told us that the Russians began probably the biggest offensive operation ever since the beginning of the special military operation. Hundreds of units of equipment, hundreds of soldiers, hundreds of everything were attacking the Ukrainian positions. Zelensky stated that all those attacks were repelled, and today we will discuss these attacks. We'll discuss them in details. So let's start from these attacks, let's start from other attacks, and first let's talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the territory of the Russian Federation. As for the morning of the 18th of April, we have several changes on the ground in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Garnal. Today, the Russian sources published this video where we can see how the Russians were taking under control the territories in the fields between the city, the village of Garnal, and the church. So the Russians told us and show us geolocations in the videos that they continue advancing on the ground, and currently the heaviest clashes are taking place on the territory of the settlement itself. Furthermore, the Russians published this video where we can see how they were bombing and attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in the northern part of the settlement of Garnal along Ulica Gora. This is probably the area where the Russians are planning to answer the village in the very near future. Obviously, and no matter the results of talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, we believe that the Russians will try to secure the territory of the Russian Federation in the very near future and before any possible ceasefire. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Vovchansk direction, where despite all these talks, despite all this possible ceasefire, the Russians continue destroying logistics of the armored forces of Ukraine along the river of Volcha. Today the Russian sources published another video where they were bombing and attacking the bridge in the area in the vicinity of Vovchansk that Ukrainians were using to supply and support their forces in the northern part, to the north of the river. So we see that the Russians most likely indeed have some plans for this territory, and we expect that after the Russians destroy the logistics, the Russians will begin offensive and they will try to establish complete control over the territories that are located on, let's say, the Russian side of the river of Volcha. When talking about this side, this approximately the territories that the Russians may try to take under control in the very near future, and this might be the first stage of possible offensive operation in the southern direction with the purpose to meet the Russian forces that are currently advancing in the northwestern part and in the northern part of the Kupiansk direction, where also during the previous 12 hours we got additional updates. Let's discuss them in details. According to information we have, during the previous, let's say 12 hours, 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions between the settlements of Mala Shapkovka and Kondrashevka. So these territories were taken by the Russians. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 17th of April of 2025. And by the way, by the end of the 17th of April, there were lots of reports, lots of articles published by pro-Russian resources that all these territories were already taken by the Russians a long time ago. But just yesterday in the evening and this morning we got geolocation published by the Ukrainian sources, where we can see how the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russian units in this direction. Furthermore, we have several videos how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians in the same area. So based on all these videos, we made a small adjustment and we have adjusted all this territory in the Russian favor. But the Ukrainians published the video how they were counterattacking the Russian units in the eastern part of Mala Shapkovka, which means that most likely the village of Mala Shapkovka, despite the territory of the village of Mala Shapkovka, despite several reports from the Russian side, is under complete Ukrainian control. During the previous day, the Ukrainian sources also published this video. And this video we can see how the Russians attack this big building with the use of FAB 1500. So we see that now the Russians are concentrated on the western part of the city of Kupiansk and in the northern western part of the same settlement, trying to destroy as many as possible positions, to destroy the temporary deployment points, and with the purpose to move further, with the purpose to encircle or semi-encircle the city of Kupiansk itself. Now let's move further. As for the Leman direction, as you can see during the previous 12 hours, we got a lot of very important updates, and most of them are coming from the territory of the settlement by the name of Nova. As you can see, we have adjusted the map. We have lots of icons, so let's first of all compare the map. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 17th of April. The Russians just caught this settlement in pincers from the south and from the north, and we expected that most likely the Russians would begin their offensive operation in the near future, and today we start receiving first geolocations that confirm the presence of the armored force of the Russian Federation on the central and on the southern part of this settlement. In this video that was published by the Ukrainian side, we can see how the Ukrainians were attacking the positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation on the southern part of the settlement with FPV drones. When talking about this video, we don't see let's say episodes where we can clearly see Russian soldiers. We just can see attacks of FPV drones from Ukrainian side in this area. Also, we have videos from the central and the northern parts, the same story. The Ukrainians were attacking the positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation, but once again, when talking even about this video, we will not see even a single Russian soldier. But anyway, the Ukrainians were attacking, which means that most likely there were Russian soldiers on the territory of these buildings. Here we can see the same story. The Ukrainians attacked the building without even a sign of the presence of the Russian soldier on the territory of this small construction. Anyway, most of the mappers, including neutral mappers, adjusted their maps in the Russian favor, and we did the same. We believe that the village of Nova is about to be taken by the Russians, and this is going to be probably the biggest problem for the Ukrainians, the biggest operational crisis for the Ukrainians on the Leman and on the Barova directions. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Торецк direction. As you can see, during the previous night we haven't received almost anything, but very interesting details we got from the Kiban direction. According to several pro-Russian resources, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to cut the salient between the settlements of Kalinovo, Keramik, and Alexandropol. We're talking about this field, so basically the Ukrainians realized that they were a very high risk of being encircled by the Russians, and basically during the previous night, or maybe during the previous day, they abandoned their positions and avoid this encirclement. And the Russians basically took under control territories that were completely, let's say, empty and cleared and without Ukrainian soldiers. Now we came to the first area where the Russians, according to Zelensky, started one of their biggest offensive operations, and we are talking about the eastern flank of the Pokrovska agglomeration. I'll remind you that we've been talking about this territory for probably 2 or 3 weeks, and we were waiting and expected that the Russians were about to begin their offensive operation. I'll remind you that we were talking a lot about the settlement of Malinovka, how the Russians were bombing and attacking, were pummeling the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in this territory, just with one purpose: to destroy as many as possible strongholds, temporary deployment points, ammo depots, warehouses, and then after the Russians finished this mission, they began offensive. But the Russians were trying to attack not the settlement of Miropolye, Malinovka, and Mirna itself. The Russians tried to attack in the direction of the settlement of Mirolubovka. And as you can see, according to different mappers and according to Zelensky, we have a lot of icons. First of all, different mappers adjusted their maps in their favor, telling us indeed the Russians answered the village, but it's very difficult and it's unclear whether the Russians managed to dig in deeper or not. Furthermore, we have the video itself. This video was published by the Ukrainians, and this is very important thing that I would like to point to attention. This video was published by the 14th Brigade of Special Purpose, Chervona Kalina, and they show us how they were repelling the Russian attack, how the Russians suffered huge losses, how the Russians lost lots of tanks, vehicles, and many other things. One of the episodes was located exactly in this point, so maybe right now there are very heavy clashes for the settlement, but of course, as for now, we will not see anything because Ukrainians will not publish this. But this is not the most important. The most important, once again, that this attack was repelled or coordinated, or let's say by the 14th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, 14th Operational Brigade, Chervona Kalina National Guard. And I'll remind you that several days ago we talked that Ukrainians finished the construction or finished the creation of the first military corps. And according to information we have, this 14th Operational Brigade Chervona Kalina is a part of this first military corps of the National Guard. I'll remind you that there are several units there. This first corps has the 14th Brigade of Chervona Kalina. This corps has the brigade of 12th Special Purpose Brigade Azov also is a part of this unit, and we have another unit that is also part, 15th Operational Brigade Karadak National Guard. This is the third unit that inside of this first corps, and as you can see, all these 3 units, all these 3 brigades of the first corps of the Armored Forces of Ukraine are located on this line between the settlements of Constantinople and the city of Pokrovsk. So you see 3 brigades out of 5 brigades are located in this area. Another 4th brigade is located on the territory of the Kupiansk direction. We're talking about the 1st Presidential Brigade Burevey, but maybe this brigade will be also redeployed in the direction of the city of Pokrovsk. So we believe that Ukrainians finished the creation of this first corps with the purpose to, let's say, charge this brigade as responsible corps for defense of the Pokrovsk-Constantinople arc. So we are coming to the beginning of the special military operation when the Russians were fighting with the Azov groups on the territory of Mariupol, and now we are coming to another major battle where the corps of Azov is going to try to save control over this arc. Obviously, this is going to be very interesting. Once again, today we are expecting for additional details about the battle for Mirolubovka, and this is the beginning of outflanking of the Pokrovska agglomeration, obviously. Now let's move further and let's discuss discuss the situation in the Bogatyr direction, where the Russians, according to different sources, as a result of offensive operation, managed to answer the settlement of Bogatyr from the southeast. This information was provided us by very reliable and different pro-Russian resources. Furthermore, we have video from the city of Constantinople, from the village of Constantinople, where we can see how the Russians were evacuating the Ukrainians, the civilians, from the territory of the village, or from the things that remained from this village. So as you can see, this video confirms that the Russians are pushing, and most likely the settlement of Constantinople was taken by the Russians by the beginning of the 18th of April completely, because the Russians were evacuating civilians from this part. And I'll remind you that during the previous days we were talking lots of videos how the Ukrainians were abandoning their positions in the fields in Constantinople, and how they were trying to evacuate and to get as many as possible units to the territory of Bogatyr. But now we see that the Russians used the situation, and on the shoulders of the Ukrainians, the Russians answered the southeastern part of the settlement, and currently there are very heavy clashes for this territory. Now let's move further. Now let's talk about the second offensive operation that was carried out by the Russians. We have already talked about this yesterday. We are talking about the battle for the settlement of Takmachka. So once again, the Russians used also lots of units and forces during that attack. Zelensky stated that the Russians used hundreds of vehicles, soldiers, millions of soldiers, and billions of vehicles, and they managed to destroy trillions of everything. So this is the situation, and according to different mappers, according to the geolocation, the Russians managed to take under control the southeastern part of the settlement of Takmachka, which is very important. As for this direction, the most important value has this construction. This is the former prison, Ukrainian prison, and this is something like a stronghold. If the Russians are able to take this stronghold under complete control, then I believe we can start counting days before the fall of the city of Orekhov. And that's it for the short video on military summary. Channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.